At sunset, Rome celebrated love with music, wine, and flowers. But when the torches were lit and the doors closed, something far older and darker took control. For Roman brides, marriage was not a beginning. It was a transfer of ownership, sealed by law and enforced by ritual. Mothers warned their daughters not to hope, only to survive. Historians praised Rome's greatness, but buried the night every bride feared most. Tonight, we uncover the ritual Rome tried to erase, and the truth hidden behind the wedding veil. The night before ownership at sunset, Rome celebrated love. After sunset, Rome enforced power, and every bride learned the difference too late. The saffron veil rested against Valeria Quintina's face like a living thing, heavy with the scent of crushed flowers and something older, something closer to fear. She was 19 years old, standing in the atrium of her father's house, surrounded by marble that had watched generations of women leave and never return as the same person. Voices echoed beyond the columns, laughter, wine, congratulations, but none of it reached her. All she could hear was time moving forward, step by step, toward sunset. Until this morning, she had been a daughter, protected by her father's authority, allowed small freedoms that Roman girls mistook for independence. By nightfall, she would belong to someone else entirely. Rome called it marriage. The women called it survival. Her mother adjusted the veil with careful hands, fingers trembling despite decades of practice. She did not speak of joy. Roman mothers rarely did. Instead, she whispered instructions shaped by experience rather than hope. Be still. Do not resist. Endure whatever comes. The words sounded gentle, but they carried the weight of generations. Valeria wanted to ask what exactly she was meant to endure, but the question died in her throat. She already knew the answer would be incomplete. In Rome, women were taught early that certain knowledge was dangerous, not because it was false, but because it was too true. Some things were learned only by living through them, and some women did not live through their wedding nights at all. Outside, the wedding feast swelled as the sun slid toward the horizon. Slaves hurried through corridors, lighting torches that would soon guide the procession through Rome's streets. Musicians tuned their instruments. Guests prepared the crude jokes that tradition demanded, jokes that turned fear into laughter and violence into celebration. Valeria watched the light change, gold to orange to red, each shift marking the erosion of the life she had known. She thought of the man waiting for her, a widower twice her age, chosen not for affection but for suitability. She had met him once. That had been enough. His gaze had not been cruel, but it had been final, the look of a man examining something that already belonged to him. An hour before sunset, Valeria retreated to a small side room where the air felt thinner, as if the walls themselves were listening. Her Aunt Cornelia followed without being asked. Cornelia had married young, been widowed early, and refused every proposal since. In Rome, that alone made her suspicious. Valeria did not waste time on politeness. She asked the question every bride asked, and no one wanted to answer. What happens tonight? Cornelia did not soften the truth. She spoke of expectations, of law, of a husband's rights, and a wife's silence. She explained that refusal was not a concept Rome recognized inside marriage, and that resistance often made things worse. She did not promise kindness. She offered strategies. Appear willing, preserve his pride, survive the first night, because it would not be the last. Cornelia's voice hardened when she spoke of the law. A wife's body did not belong to her. It never had. First it belonged to her father, then to her husband. Marriage was not a union of souls. It was a legal transfer, as formal and irreversible as the sale of land. The ceremony was merely the paperwork. The wedding night was possession made real. Cornelia held Valeria's hands and told her the only truth Roman women passed down honestly. Happiness was not guaranteed. Love was optional, but survival was essential. The women who endured were the women who learned to make themselves valuable enough not to be destroyed. When Valeria returned to the feast, she smiled as she had been taught, playing her role with precision. No one noticed the shift inside her, the moment when innocence gave way to preparation. She watched her future husband speak with her father, negotiating dowry and property, discussing her as calmly as one might discuss livestock. The sun touched the horizon. The torches flared brighter. Somewhere deep inside Rome's rituals, something ancient stirred, something older than law and colder than belief. Valeria took a breath, adjusted her veil, and stepped forward. The procession was ready. The night Rome had tried to forget was about to begin. The procession of no return Rome called its celebration. The women knew it was a delivery. Every step forward erased a way back. The procession began as the first stars appeared, torches blooming into fire along the streets like watchful eyes. And Valeria was led out of her father's house not as a daughter leaving home, but as an object being transferred under the cover of tradition. Music rose around her, sharp and festive, drowning out the sound of her own breath as the crowd gathered to watch another bride disappear into marriage. The jokes followed her, crude and ritualized, shouted by men who pretended humor softened what they openly anticipated. Laughter used as a shield against the truth that everyone understood but refused to name. Valeria walked between symbols she barely noticed before this day, children placed at her side to represent heirs she was expected to, produce slaves following with chests of dowry as proof of her value, and beside her, her husband silent and assured, already acting as if the night ahead was a matter of routine rather than fate. With every step, Rome reaffirmed its power, turning fear into pageantry and obedience into applause. The streets narrowed as the procession wound deeper into the city, past temples where gods watched without intervening, and houses whose walls had absorbed centuries of the same music, the same laughter, the same endings. Valeria's veil blurred the world into firelight and shadow, and in that half-vision she understood something the ceremonies never explained. This walk was not meant for her. It was meant for the city, for the witnesses, for Rome itself. The bride's terror was irrelevant. What mattered was that the ritual continued unchanged, generation after generation, convincing everyone that this was how things had always been, and therefore how they must remain. She tried to read her husband's face as they walked, searching for some hint of mercy or restraint, but Roman men wore their public masks well. What they were in private belonged to the night, and the night was close now. When they reached his house, the noise softened into anticipation, and the most revealing ritual of all began. Valeria was not allowed to step across the threshold. Strong hands lifted her without asking, raising her body as if it weighed nothing, carrying her into a home she had not chosen. The crowd cheered, but the meaning of the act was older than celebration, rooted in a memory Rome preferred to mythologize rather than confront. This was not symbolism for luck or clumsiness, as polite explanations claimed. It was a reenactment of taking, a reminder that marriage began not with consent, but with force, and that every bride entered her new life the same way Rome itself had once taken women to build its future. Valeria felt the truth of it in her bones, as her feet never touched the ground, as her body crossed into ownership without her participation. Inside, the household rituals unfolded quickly, efficiently, as if designed to prevent thought. Fire and water were placed in her hands, reminders of duty and service. She was shown the spaces she would manage, the rooms where she would work, the shrine where she would pray for protection she had already been denied. She spoke the ancient words that erased her former self, declaring that where her husband was, she was now the same. Her identity folded into his like cloth packed away. The guests drank and blessed and congratulated, satisfied that the transfer had been completed properly, that the city's order remained intact. Then, as tradition demanded, the room began to empty. At last, the pronuba took Valeria's hand and led her toward the bedchamber, her grip firm, her expression unreadable. The air changed as they entered, heavy with incense and expectation, the marriage bed waiting beneath dim lamps, like an altar prepared for sacrifice. Garments were removed piece by piece, symbols stripped away until only reality remained. The Pronuba paused at the door, offering no comfort, only presence, a witness stationed outside in case the ritual went wrong. Then she left, closing the door with a sound that echoed louder than any music. Valeria stood alone, listening to her own heartbeat, knowing the man who owned her body was moments away, and understanding with terrible clarity that the procession had ended, but the ritual had only just begun. The law that entered the bedchamber behind closed doors, Rome stopped pretending. The gods withdrew. The law stepped inside instead. The door closed with a finality that no ritual song could soften. And in that moment, Valeria understood something the ceremonies had carefully concealed. This room was not private. It was legal. What would happen here was not an accident of passion or a failure of character. It was the final step of a process sanctioned by Rome itself. The bedchamber was where ownership became physical, where the abstract language of law pressed itself onto flesh. Valeria stood motionless as her husband entered, carrying the confidence of a man who knew the city stood behind him. He spoke calmly, almost gently, explaining what he expected, not as a request, but as instruction. His tone was neither cruel nor kind, and that neutrality frightened her more than anger would have. In Rome, violence did not need rage. It only needed permission. To understand why this moment mattered so deeply, one must understand the law that framed it. Roman marriage was not built on consent. Consent was irrelevant once the ceremony was complete. Legal texts were explicit. A husband possessed full authority over his wife's body. This was not metaphorical. It was ownership in the strictest sense, inherited from a culture that treated women as extensions of male households rather than independent persons. What modern minds would recognize as violation, Roman law recognized as right. A husband exercising control over his wife's body was not committing an act. He was fulfilling a role. And because it was legal, it was invisible. No court would hear her. No god was obligated to intervene. The system worked precisely because it left no space for resistance to be recognized. Valeria's fear was not unique. Roman writers hinted at it in careful phrases, in advice literature written by men for men, warning husbands not to damage valuable wives too severely, not out of compassion, but out of practicality. A broken woman could not manage a household. A terrified one might miscarry. Even mercy, when it appeared, was framed as efficiency. Women learned quickly that endurance was safer than defiance, that silence preserved more than screams ever could. The wedding night was not meant to be discussed, because discussion risked exposing the machinery beneath the myth. Rome preferred its rituals polished, its power unquestioned, its victims unnamed. As the hours passed, Valeria learned what generations before her had learned in the same room. That time stretched strangely when control was absolute. That fear could become numbness if it had to. That survival sometimes meant leaving one's own body behind, watching events from a distance, because feeling everything would shatter what remained. Outside the door, the Pronuba waited, listening for sounds that would signal completion, not comfort. Her presence was not protection. It was quality control. The marriage had to be validated. The law required proof that the transfer had been finalized, that the bride was now truly a wife. Rome demanded evidence, even when it pretended modesty. By morning, the city would behave as if nothing extraordinary had happened. The bride would emerge transformed, praised for her composure, admired for her obedience. No one would ask what the night had taken from her, only what it had produced. This was the brilliance of Rome's design. It turned trauma into tradition and buried suffering beneath ceremony. Women were taught to forget not because forgetting healed them, but because memory threatened the stability of the system. A woman who remembered too clearly might speak, and a woman who spoke might make others listen. Valeria lay awake as the night deepened, aware that what she had endured was not an ending, but a beginning. The law that had entered the bedchamber would return again and again, whenever her husband chose to exercise it. Tomorrow, Rome would call her married. Tonight, she learned what that word truly meant. And somewhere beyond the walls of that house, beyond the torches and the songs, the empire rested peacefully, confident that its most disturbing truths remained exactly where it wanted them, locked behind closed doors, unheard, and legally justified. The silence that raised an empire, every Roman mother remembered this night. Every Roman wife learned to bury it. Silence was not weakness, it was survival. Morning came to Rome without ceremony, indifferent and precise, and Valeria emerged into it as though stepping into a life already in progress. Praised for her composure addressed now as a wife, her fear folded neatly into the private language of endurance that Roman women mastered early. No one asked how the night had been, because everyone already knew what questions were permitted and which ones threatened the order of things. Her mother met her at the threshold with a look that contained neither joy nor relief, only recognition, the silent acknowledgment shared between women who had crossed the same invisible boundary. This was the moment when Valeria began to understand the conspiracy that sustained Roman marriage, a conspiracy not enforced only by men or law, but by women themselves, bound together by the knowledge that speaking openly would not undo the past, but might endanger the future. Rome did not need chains when it had custom, expectation, and the disciplined silence of those who had survived. As Valeria was led through her new household, instructed in routines and responsibilities, she noticed the women around her differently. The wives who moved efficiently through marble corridors, issuing orders, managing slaves, maintaining the appearance of authority within spaces that still did not belong to them. These women were not broken. They were controlled, strategic, careful with their words and emotions. Each of them had endured a wedding night, and each of them had made a calculation afterward. Remembering too clearly served no one. Forgetting, or at least pretending to forget, allowed life to continue. This was not denial. It was adaptation. Rome rewarded women who mastered it and punished those who did not. A woman who spoke of pain too openly risked being labeled unstable, ungrateful, unfit for household leadership. Silence became a form of currency, traded for security, status, and relative peace. The older women taught Valeria what no ceremony had explained: how to anticipate a husband's moods, how to offer compliance in ways that minimized harm, how to use competence as protection, making herself indispensable, so that damage would be inconvenient rather than casual. These lessons were passed quietly, often framed as advice about housekeeping or virtue, but beneath the surface they were survival manuals written in lived experience. This was why Roman mothers wept at weddings, not because they feared separation, but because they knew exactly what awaited their daughters and exactly how little they could change it. Their grief had no language Rome would accept, so it became ritualized, hidden behind blessings and veils. Historians long puzzled over this silence, mistaking the absence of complaint for acceptance. But absence is not agreement. Roman sources rarely described the wedding night in detail, not because it was unimportant, but because it was too central, too revealing. When something must remain unquestioned to function, it is protected by omission. The law spoke clearly, but narrative did not. Art celebrated the procession, the feast, the threshold, but never the closed door that followed. What happened there was meant to be understood without being spoken, enforced without being examined. Rome's greatness rested partly on its ability to normalize what it could not morally defend. Valeria learned quickly how the system perpetuated itself. Young women were kept ignorant so that shock would overwhelm resistance. Older women were invested in silence because acknowledging the truth offered no remedy, only pain. Men benefited from a structure that framed domination as duty, and the empire benefited from stable households built on obedience rather than consent. This was not accidental. It was design. Rome did not merely conquer territories. It conquered interiors, shaping private life to serve public order. Marriage was one of its most effective tools. As days turned into routine, Valeria felt the weight of history pressing down, the realization that her suffering was neither unique nor accidental. It was inherited, maintained, and carefully disguised. And yet, beneath the practiced silence, something else existed, a quiet awareness shared among women who watched, remembered, and waited. Because silence could protect, but it could also preserve truth for the moment it was safe to surface. Rome believed it had buried this ritual forever. It did not know that fragments remained, hidden in law codes, whispered customs, and the unbroken line of women who remembered even when they did not speak. And centuries later, those fragments would begin to surface, threatening to expose what the empire had worked so hard to forget. The truth buried in the margins, Rome erased the memory, not the evidence. The silence cracked where law met ritual, and history began to whisper back. Long after Valeria's lifetime faded into dust, Rome's carefully maintained silence began to fail in places its architects never expected. Not in poems or triumphal histories, not in statues or official chronicles, but in the margins of legal texts and half-explained customs, in rituals performed so mechanically that their meaning was no longer understood. Scholars would later notice something unsettling. The most important moment of Roman marriage, the night that transformed a woman's legal status and bodily reality, was almost entirely absent from narrative description. The omission was not random. It was systematic. Where Rome spoke endlessly about power, virtue, and order, it grew quiet when the conversation turned inward, toward the bedroom where authority was exercised most completely. The clues survived because law had to be precise, even when morality was not. Legal commentaries described a husband's rights with disturbing clarity, outlining the extent of control granted over a wife's body, movement, and labor. These were not moral arguments. They were instructions. The language was dry, administrative, stripped of emotion, and that was precisely what made it revealing. Violence hidden inside ritual becomes invisible, but violence codified into law leaves fingerprints. Each clause, each clarification, betrayed the reality that Roman marriage was built on enforced access, not mutual agreement. What had been unspeakable in story was unavoidable in statute. Archaeology added its own quiet testimony. Inscriptions honoring wives praised obedience and endurance more often than affection. Household shrines depicted harmony without intimacy, order without warmth. Wedding jokes preserved in literature, long dismissed as crude humor, suddenly read differently when placed beside legal authority. They were not jokes at all, but acknowledgments, social pressure disguised as laughter, a way to normalize what could not be denied. Even the threshold ritual, carried out long after its origin was supposedly forgotten, preserved the memory of abduction and force. Rome reenacted its founding violence every time a bride was lifted and carried, reminding everyone present, consciously or not, how marriage truly began. Most telling were the women's silences themselves. Letters from Roman wives, rare as they are, speak carefully, circling around experience without naming it. Advice passed between women focuses obsessively on endurance, usefulness, and caution, not love. Mothers warned daughters without explanation. Aunts prepared nieces without detail. This pattern repeated across centuries, across regions, across classes. It was not coincidence. It was collective strategy. Women protected each other by limiting knowledge to what was necessary for survival, knowing that full truth offered no escape, only despair. The empire relied on this restraint. Rome did not need to censor women who censored themselves for safety. Modern historians once argued that absence of complaint implied acceptance, that Roman women must have viewed marriage differently. That cultural context softened what modern eyes found troubling. But context does not erase harm. It explains how harm becomes routine. When every institution supports a practice, when law, religion, and custom align, resistance becomes almost unthinkable. The wedding night was not hidden because it was rare or shameful. It was hidden because it was foundational. Exposing it would have forced Rome to confront the cost of its stability, the price paid quietly by half its population. As these fragments are reassembled, a different Rome emerges, one less polished and more honest. Not a civilization uniquely cruel, but one brutally efficient in converting domination into tradition. Valeria's fear was not personal weakness. It was rational awareness. Her silence was not consent. It was survival within a system designed to leave no alternative. The ritual Rome tried to hide did not vanish. It lingered, embedded in language, law, and memory, waiting for a time when someone would dare to read between the lines. And yet, understanding this truth raises a more disturbing question, one Rome never asked, and perhaps hoped no one ever would. If an empire so admired could build itself on normalized suffering and call it order, what does that say about the foundations of other civilizations that followed its example? Rome's ritual was not an aberration. It was a mirror. And the reflection it offers does not stop with the ancient world. The shadow Rome left behind Rome buried the ritual beneath marble and law. But shadows do not disappear. They travel forward in time. The final truth of the Roman wedding night is not found in what happened to Valeria alone, but in what Rome taught the world to accept afterward. Because empires do not vanish when their borders fall. They survive in habits, assumptions, and systems quietly inherited. Rome perfected a model where domination was reframed as order, where suffering was made respectable through ritual, and where silence was praised as virtue. And when the empire collapsed, these ideas did not collapse with it. They migrated. They resurfaced in medieval law, in religious doctrine, in customs that continued to treat women's bodies as obligations rather than selves, echoing the same logic Rome had once written into stone. The language softened over centuries. The ceremonies changed their costumes, but the structure endured. Authority disguised as tradition, coercion hidden behind duty, pain reframed as destiny. This is why Rome tried to forget its own ritual, because remembering it too clearly would expose how much of civilization was built not on consent, but on control that learned how to speak politely. Valeria's story ends where history prefers to stop paying attention, not with rebellion or justice, but with continuation. She lived. She adapted. She learned the same careful silence that had kept women alive for generations before her, and in doing so, she became part of the mechanism Rome relied on. This does not make her complicit. It makes her human. Systems of power do not require monsters to function. Only ordinary people doing what they must to survive. Rome did not need cruelty shouted from rooftops. It needed rituals repeated, laws obeyed, questions unasked. That is how the most enduring forms of domination work. They convince their victims that endurance is wisdom and that resistance is foolishness, until the distinction between the two becomes impossible to see. The uncomfortable lesson of the Roman wedding night is not that ancient people were worse than we are. It is that they were familiar. The same justifications appear again and again across history. This is how it has always been. This is necessary for stability. This suffering serves a greater good. Rome believed itself rational, advanced, enlightened, and in many ways it was. But progress in one direction often hides regression in another. The empire that built aqueducts and roads also engineered silence. The civilization that prized law and order used both to erase the experiences of those it controlled most completely. The ritual was hidden, not because it was marginal, but because it was central, too revealing to examine honestly. When modern historians reconstruct these fragments, when they read the laws closely, questioned the jokes, and listened to the gaps where women's voices should be, they are not attacking the past. They are acknowledging it. And acknowledgement matters, because unexamined traditions have a way of repeating themselves under new names. Rome's shadow reminds us that civilization is not measured only by what it builds, but by what it normalizes, by who pays the cost of order, and by whose suffering is declared necessary, and therefore unworthy of memory. The night Roman brides feared most was never just one night. It was a system refined, justified, and inherited. Rome tried to hide it because it understood something deeply unsettling. If people looked too closely at how power truly works in private spaces, the grandeur of public monuments would lose their shine. The past does not accuse us. It warns us. And the warning Rome leaves behind is simple and chilling. When suffering becomes tradition and silence becomes virtue, the ritual is never really gone. It is only waiting for history to repeat itself under a different name.